I just feel like I'm just an ordinary person. And I had people come to me and say, "Oh, you're very ordinary." And I'm like, "Oh, yes, thank you very much." I didn't need to have a Facebook account. I didn't even have a LinkedIn account. I didn't have any social media account. It's very difficult to keep up a persona that isn't you. So I looked at my party badge. I'm like, 25 years. I feel old.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of The Usual Place. I'm your host Natasha, and today on the show I have Miss Sun Xueling, Minister of State at the Ministry of Home Affairs as well as the Ministry of Social and Family Development. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Natasha.
It's been a rainy season, but today there is no rain.
So far,
fingers crossed. So I want to talk a little bit about your two portfolios, which under one you deal with efforts to combat family violence and the other one, you fight the scourge of scams and cyber crime. And beyond your role in driving policy, you're also the MP for Punggol West SMC, and you're also the author of children's books. Yes. That's a lot. That's a lot of things you do.
I have varied interests.
Okay, well, I want to start with your policy work and especially what you do with MSF first. You know, in recent months, we've had legislation to strengthen protection for survivors of family violence, and then there's new resources for young children to protect themselves against sexual abuse, and there's the Healthy Family Boundaries guidelines for professionals in the industry, right? How concerned should we be about family violence and abuse?
Last year, the MSF published the domestic violence annual trends for the first time. So we're looking at numbers. We've always been looking at numbers over the years, but we published a report last year because we wanted to have a benchmark to make sure every year when we look at the numbers, we know where we're trending and what we should be looking out for. So if you look at the numbers, I think the numbers are concerning.
Did it shock you when you saw it?
Yes, I think if you look at it internationally, our incidence rate is not considered high. But regardless, in a developed country like Singapore, and we are a small country, meaning that people stay close to one another, right? So if your neighbour there's domestic violence at home, then we should be reporting it, right? And if there are children crying, being beaten up, and so on and so forth, then I think we should know we are a very closely knit society. I think we will get a good sense of what's happening around us. And when we look at the numbers, we released the domestic violence trends report last year for the first time. And when we look at the numbers in terms of child abuse, serious child abuse cases, we're talking about 2,100 cases per year, thereabouts. And the lesser serious but still cases that we should be concerned about 2,700 cases per year. Per year, you know. You add those both up together, we're talking about close to 5,000 cases. I think it's not something that we can live with and accept in Singapore. And many of these cases deal with physical abuse, neglect. We're talking about child victims who are mostly under 12 years old. So I think this is something that's unconscionable, something we should do something about.
What actually pushed MSF to release it for the first time, this trend report?
We've been monitoring the numbers over the years. I mean, every year there is a set of data that we released on the MSF website. But this is the first time whereby we have tiered them by some indicator of seriousness. But I just want to be very clear. It's not that just because there is a tier 1 or tier 2 that it means necessarily that we only pay attention to one tier, not the other. We take all the cases seriously and want to do something about it. But like I said, we've been monitoring the numbers every year. But we wanted to have a reference point, and that's why we released the trends report, so that year by year, when we work with our practitioners, we work with our child protective services, our protection specialist centres on the ground, we know what last year's numbers were, we know what are the number of cases everyone is managing, and we're able to better look at resource management, look at the training that's required, and look at who we need to bring in, stakeholders, so that we can manage this problem effectively together.
I think in Singapore, the mentality is like, is your business right? Like, it's behind closed doors, right? You know, like, what do you say to that?
Well, that is definitely, I think, this notion that we're trying to break. So we have this Break the Silence campaign, because I think it's always useful to err on the side of caution, because you're talking about someone who may be getting hurt. You know, not just about physical hurt, you know, it could be emotional abuse, it could be sexual abuse, it could be neglect. The two highest abuse acts are actually physical abuse and neglect. And we talk about children, right? I think it's terrible, right? I mean, we've seen cases whereby a young boy has been belted 100 times, you know, or not given adequate nutrition. I mean, this is Singapore. I mean, how can we accept it? But at the same time, I would also like to say that because, we had the COVID period. So actually for some time, the courts weren't quite able to go through the cases at the pace that they were doing so before that. And that's why there was a little bit of a clumping of cases. And that's why when it all came on the papers, it gave people the impression that there were actually a lot more cases of abuse happening. And we're not even talking about the spousal abuse cases, right? There's another category, and elder abuse and so on and so forth. So I think family violence, domestic violence is definitely something that we cannot look away from. And then each and every one of us has a role to play, to report on your neighbor if you sense that something is amiss. For a teacher in school, if you think one of your young charges, a student is perhaps being neglected at home or being abused at home, then raise the alarm to the MSF so that Child Protective Services can take a look at it. I think each and every one of us can do something.
What if I'm not sure? Like, I think because you don't want your neighbor to be like, have MSF turn up at their door and then they're like, oh no, actually it was just a...
But we're just checking, right? And we have the National Anti-Violence and Sexual Harassment Helpline. It's a national hotline. We receive maybe 8,000, 9,000 calls a year. And, people are calling up. Not every case that people call up is that it's definitely a child abuse case or something like that, right? Sometimes people are just calling up because they have an inquiry. But it's okay. We have the resources to take these calls. And like I say, I think the way we look at it is that we'd rather be safe than sorry. Because for one case that you don't address, what if a child gets killed, or a spouse gets beaten up so severely that they become handicapped or something? I don't think we want to play with that. No.
When you hear of these cases, what is your immediate reaction?
I get reports, right, over email, and they come accompanied by images, pictures of the abuse that has been suffered. It's terrible. It's sometimes it really disturbs me, and it. I think anybody would be disturbed by it. And then the question for us is, what can we do about it, right? It's always a difficult decision as to whether we should remove the child from the family. The first instinct is always to protect and to remove. It's easy to remove. The question is, how do you reintegrate the child back into society, back into a family? And so where it's possible, we try to look for a foster family because we're talking about a young child. And a child should be growing up in a family environment where they know that there is a father, there is a mother, there are possibly siblings, there are grandparents, and there is a system of support, you see. If you put a child in a residential home, they're staying with peers, yes, but it's after all like a dormitory. And it's not so natural, right? And the children there have all faced difficulties and challenges in their own different backgrounds. So I think it's more healthy, more sustainable for the child to be in a family. And so actually our first preference is where there is a young victim to find a foster family for the child, if we have no choice but to take the child away from the family, from their biological parents, that is to say.
Your portfolio is really about helping a lot of people deal with hard things in their life.
Yes, with the more vulnerable segments of our society. Yeah.
Is that something you asked to be put into?
No. It's interesting, but I guess somehow when you come into a portfolio, like whether or not it's a Ministry of Social and Family Development or Ministry of Home Affairs, there are so many things to do, right? You work on something, and then sometimes that one thing leads to another thing. And then you start kind of connecting the dots. So there is no very distinct or clear pathway that is decided at the start. Yes. Sure, there is a broad division of labour amongst the different public office holders, but what you decide to focus on and how you decide to chart it, there are flexibilities. So I think for myself, some may think that, hey, what's the connection and the synergy between MHA and MSF? And to me, family violence is that nexus. Because the MSF side of the house, you look after the victim and the survivors, you think about how to protect them. And on the MHA side, you think about the perpetrators, right? And you do want to see the law enforcement officers and the social workers come together. And I think that is best characterized by the efforts we had when we launched the Domestic Violence Emergency Response Team. Because in the past, it was just the policemen who turned up at the door. But when the police are concerned, if it's not an arrestable offence on the spot, they can't take away the perpetrator of violence. Sometimes it's just a threat. No violence has been committed yet. But to the spouse who is being threatened, for instance, it doesn't give the spouse any comfort, right? That this potential
person is still like in the house, right?
Yeah. So that's where social workers, and that's our new system now. Social workers and the police officers turn up at the same time. That's why it's called the Domestic Violence Emergency Response Team. And they assess the situation together. So if the police decide, I can't arrest this chap, right? Then the social worker takes over, triages, decides whether or not they should have an emergency plan, for the victim, potential victim, for example, moving to a place of safety, a crisis shelter, for instance, or if not, then the next day, the day after, they will follow up to make sure, do some counselling, find out what's best for, the spouse as well as the children, if there are children, and decide what next for the family, whether or not you need to go for family counselling together and so on and so forth. So we didn't start out, or I didn't start out in 2020 with this portfolio, knowing that we'll get to this point, right? But that was the synergy that I found in my two portfolios.
So your background is actually in finance.
Yes, finance and investments, yes.
How did you grow into this role, dealing with families and also with scams, which we'll come to a bit later, but yeah.
When I joined the government in 2018, the portfolios that were given to me were the Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of National Development. And yes, they are not related to finance and investments, but then the Prime Minister said they wanted someone in those roles. So I just took it up, and I
Cannot
just
reject.
figured...
Like, no thanks,
It
bye.
didn't occur to me. I just thought that, there must be good reason why he thought that I would be suited for the role. And since I wasn't so familiar with these two ministries, I thought I would just go in and learn and contribute where I can. And I'm glad I'm able to identify areas where I could focus on and work with the team on, and also, roll out policies and initiatives on the ground.
Okay. So now the other side of your portfolio is dealing with MHA and scams and cybercrime. I want to talk about scams because we keep getting scammed. Like, okay, so I have numbers, okay? So there was a joint study by a non-profit organization, which is Global Anti-Scam Alliance, so that's GASA, as they're called, and Data Service Provider Scam Advisor, right? So they released in November 2024, and what they highlighted was that between August 2022 and August 2023, so that's a year on year, right? The scammers stole an estimated $1.02 trillion globally, and that victims in Singapore lost most money on average.
Yes.
Scams are not a new thing.
Yes.
But why do we keep getting scammed?
Well, there are many, many reasons. Okay, first, generally speaking, Singaporeans have quite a bit of savings in their bank accounts. And I think if we look at the scam types that we are more vulnerable falling prey to, if we look at last year's numbers, about half, slightly more than half the number of scams and where the highest scam losses are, they are related to government official impersonation scam, investment scam, love scams. And all these scams, there is quite a large degree of social engineering. So when we look at the numbers, 86% of scam reports and 90% of scam losses are due to these types of scams where it's really about social engineering. Where someone calls up, pretends to be the police, somebody calls up pretending to be your friend, somebody calls up offering you an investment opportunity, and people fall for it because trust in authority, greed, desire for companionship and love. These are all human characteristics. Yeah. But I think it comes back to important things to do. Number one, check the official sources. And number two, go and check it out or tell this person, right, that I will call you back. And then you call the hotline that's listed as the official source and you ask to speak to the person that the scammer had purported to be to confirm whether or not it's really, that this police officer had called you up.
So is it now harder for law enforcement or, people in authority to do their jobs? Because, for example, like if someone from CPF is actually calling me, then I'm like, no, there's a scam, bye. And then they're like, no, but I just want to talk to you about your account.
So I think that's the scary thing about scams, you see, because it erodes trust in society. So it has happened to me before. So I've missed calls from my children's school.
Okay.
I've missed calls from the National Library Board. Like proper agencies and institutions, right? Because they call up using like their general line or what. So if I look at this number, I'm like, I don't recognize this number. I didn't save it. Must be a scam, right? Even though it's a local call and everything. So I just don't pick it up. So I had this instance where the school called me up like 4 times because they wanted to get my my consent to have my children go for an excursion. And I was like the only parent who hadn't given a consent because I didn't check my parents' gateway and so forth, right? So they were like, do we bring this child for excursion? And they called me up 4 times and I refused to pick it up. And finally, when I picked it up and they said, I'm calling from XXX primary school, I'm like, yeah, very skeptical, right? Very skeptical. And they were like, we're calling about this. And it was only further down the road, right? In that conversation, I realized, okay, oh, sorry, Then they were like, why didn't you pick up our call? I said, I thought you were a scammer. And that sounded so lame, right? At that point in time, because...
No, but it is a thing. Like, I get a call almost every other day. Even when your colleague called me today, because I don't have his number, then I was like, it's a scam.
Sure not.
Then I picked it up, then I didn't say anything. Then he spoke, then I was like, okay, not a scam.
Yes.
But every other day, that's a lot.
Yes. So we're trying to do many things. We launched this Scam Shield suite, so that people can report numbers if they know that, they suspect it to be a scam, or they can check against official sources and so on and so forth. But coming back to your question, yes, it is causing issues because it erodes trust in society. So legitimate agencies like even MSF, sometimes they try to conduct surveys on the phone, or sometimes they turn up in person to conduct an in-person survey to find out about how citizens feel about government services and so on and so forth. And people don't want to open the door, people don't want to pick up the phone because they're afraid it's a scam. Yeah.
If someone calls you and he's a scammer, what's your best comeback line?
Actually, I've spoken about this to the police force before, because some of the police officers have tried to engage and just draw out the conversation, waste the scammer's time, right? There are pluses and there are minuses. And I would not recommend this to members of the public, because there have been cases before where the scammer on the other side gets a bit vengeful. And then because he has your number, right, he called you up, right? And he knows you're wasting his time. And he knows you're trying to be nasty to him. There have been cases where they then publicize your number over Telegram and whatsoever and just get people to bombard you. Things like that can happen. So I can understand why members of the public may want to take retaliatory action, but to protect our members of the public, I would much prefer that they report the number to the Singapore Police Force and let the police force deal with it.
Okay. So don't have a drawn-out conversation and you're like, okay, understood. Okay. I want to ask you something about that you did for scams, which you actually did dance to promote the act, check, tell steps, right? It was one of your most popular videos on TikTok. Okay. What's up?
The plus and minuses.
You're cringing about it. Did you decide to do it? Did you come up with the steps by yourself?
Actually, it was totally just very random. I just did I think it was a dialogue that I did. So I was actually having a anti-scam community, conversation, trying to find out from different groups of people about what steps they should take. So migrant workers, they are a bit more vulnerable to maybe say loan scams, for instance, or government official impersonation scam as well, because they may not be so familiar with our laws. And I was talking to students as well, talking to the elderly, and so I was having this dialogue and this community session. And someone shared with me, why don't you do a TikTok video? And so I just walked out wearing whatever I was wearing. And somebody told me that, I just did it on the go.
So it was very impromptu.
Very, very impromptu.
Do you remember the steps now?
No, I don't. Actually, I don't. I don't. So that was once off, and I don't think I'll do it again.
But you do have a couple of dances that you do on
when I go for activities, and sometimes to just get the crowd going, right? The host, the MC, they will say, hey, let's do this, because it's popular right now. And you just want to be a good sport also, right? Because there is an audience there, as in people who are at the gathering physically there. Typically people follow whoever's in front of you, right? So the third row follows the second row follows the first row, right? And if you're sitting on the first or the second row, you want to be a good sport, right? So, but the thing is that we don't get chances to rehearse it, because it's like the first time we are hearing about it, first time we're seeing it, right? So you just keep your fingers crossed that the steps are not too difficult. And that's it.
And you don't become a meme?
Well, sometimes you wonder, should I put this up? Then you wonder that, if you don't put it up, someone else is going to put it up, right? Because social media is just so random. So I thought, just roll with it.
Okay. Yeah. Speaking of social media, it's a lot different from when you started in 2015, right?
I didn't have a Facebook account, until... I don't know, a week or so before the elections, and someone said, everyone needs to have a Facebook account. And I was like, because previously I was in the private sector. I was in the finance and investments industry, right? I didn't need to have a Facebook account. I didn't even have a LinkedIn account. I didn't have any social media account because, to be honest, I was very, very busy with my physical life running around. I didn't have time to go on social media. But I was told that back in 2015 that you have to have a social media presence and so that people know who you are and so on and so forth. So I embarked on it. It was a very steep learning curve.
Do you enjoy it? Do you feel like you're giving a little bit more of yourself than you would like to, but you have no choice?
Well, I think with social media and its intensity, it's important to obviously be comfortable in your own skin and put up things that are authentic to yourself. Because otherwise, it's very difficult to keep up a persona that isn't you. Right. So some people tell me, hey, you do this weekly storytelling for children. I'm on my 153rd episode or something like that, right? And when I started off, I didn't have this grand strategy that I was going to do it. It started during COVID because I just felt that I have many young families in Punggol West and I wanted to reach out to them. And since I couldn't meet them as often as I could because it was COVID, couldn't meet them up face to face, I wanted to be able to talk to them. And I was concerned about children. And people were telling me about books that were written during the COVID period for children because children didn't know what to make out of wearing masks and not being able to go out, not being able to go to the playground and so on and so forth. So actually that was what sparked my storytelling sessions on Facebook Live. And then once I stopped, I realized I quite enjoy it. I enjoy reading library books for children week after week. I've got young children. They're growing older, obviously, year by year. I have them read along with me, as in they also get to choose which are the books that they think are good. And so I don't find it a chore. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to pivot to an exciting year that we will have because it's GE year. It must happen this year for sure.
It must happen this year.
And I want to talk about, you've been in politics for 10 years now. This will be your 10th year. And actually you've been in the grassroots and helping out with the PAP for a very long time.
Yes.
You actually started with the Meet the People session at Buona Vista, right? With the PAP.
So this is my 25th year. So I looked at my party badge. I'm like, 25 years. I feel old.
25 years ago, I wanted to ask you what gave you the reason. What was your reason for wanting to do this?
Actually, it all started quite normal. I didn't have this plan. In fact, I spent many years away from Singapore in my career. So it wasn't like I wanted to be a politician from the get-go. It was just that I wanted to know more about what was happening in the community. I wanted to see how, as a young person, I could be helpful. And it was a huge learning experience. Obviously, at age 19 and 20, I hadn't yet bought a HDB flat, nor was I considering to do so at that point in time. But when you go for a Meet the People session and you talk to people and you realize that these are what, citizens and residents are thinking about. How do I become financially independent? How do I settle down, apply for a flat? How do I ensure career stability? Or as an elder person, if I don't understand correspondences that are mailed to me by the government, then what do I do about it? Very real life situations. And as a 19-year-old or 20-year-old, I found it a huge learning experience. I was actually benefiting, from talking to residents, citizens, and actually trying to think about what we can do to be helpful. So it started from a very simple, find out more, learn along the way, and I made many good friends when I was volunteering. It gave my work certain meaning and purpose. And so that was what started me out. And of course, I had good support. I mean, my grandmother was very encouraging towards it. I think it also feels good to know that you're trying to do something for especially the lower income and so on. So that was how I started. Really.
You mentioned your grandmother, because you stayed with her growing up, right? So did she encourage you to join it, or was she interested in your work with, the Meet the People session? Did she ask you about it?
She wasn't literate, if you know what I mean, because many older people of that generation, they aren't. But they felt that they have benefited through the system, right? And so I think she was very positive that I was doing something in the community. And that was just it. I was 19. She was already, late 70s. It's just that, do a good thing. It's as simple as that. Do a good deed, do a good thing. Go and be helpful to people. That was it.
So I also want to ask you, as an MP for the area, and then with the general election happening this year, we will see many political parties walking the ground. And, recently there was that fracas between PAP and PSP volunteers. And it brought attention to the dynamics of political engagement, on the
Yes.
ground. So do you think moments like these shape public perception of political parties? Like what lessons can we draw from that incident?
I mean, definitely. I mean, members of the public are free to form their opinions or anything that anybody in the public says and does. Right? I think for myself, the way I look at it is that it's important to be respectful, and it should work both ways. Right? Unfortunately, there'll be instances whereby you might meet people who are a bit more rowdy, who may be feeling angst about certain personal issues that they face. It has happened to me on my rounds before. Sometimes you just happen to perhaps be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Somebody may be having a real critical issue and you are the one who knocks on the door as an MP. And you open the door and you get a huge
Scolding.
and you're like, no head, no tail, right? Like, why is this resident so unhappy, right? So then you just listen. And sometimes you realize it's because lost a job or undergoing a difficult divorce. But it's not so well defined, the problem when the door opens and somebody just offloads on you, because it's just bits and pieces, right? And you just have to spend time to understand. So my approach has always been to listen, because it's only when you listen then you're able to piece together what's happening, and to understand that, and to start with the point that there should be good reason why this person is unhappy, and then just try to work through the issue step by step, because sometimes it's not so clear to the resident actually how he or she wants you to help him or her. I've seen it happen oftentimes at MPS. Somebody comes and just downloads the whole load, and then sometimes the timeline is not very matching. Then sometimes you're like, wow, so many different characters. So I think fundamentally patience is required. Try to encourage respect on both ends. Whether or not this will go public or whatsoever, I think that's not on my mind. It's just about those one-on-one interactions. How do you be a person or a friend to that person? Because obviously he or she is in pain. So that's just how I approach it. Yeah.
Okay. I also want to ask you about your personal life. Being an MP, that part also kind of comes in because people talk about you online. Do you know that there's like a 500-pager thread of you?
I try not to look at these things. It distracts me. And
does it concern you? Because I mean, I looked at it.
There is a 500-page. Okay, all right.
On this particular forum, I'll just
right.
leave it there. But
Okay.
basically, everything you do gets dissected.
I just feel like I'm just an ordinary person. And I had people come up to me and say, you're very ordinary. And I'm like, oh, yes, thank you very much. I mean, like,
That's rude.
Oh, really?
I think what do you mean you're very ordinary? It's like, okay. I feel like. It's like, it sounds to me, it's like, okay.
No, it has happened to me before. I remember I once went to one of the hospitals for a checkup, and I was at a toast box. Like sometimes you wait, right, for your turn, then you have a coffee. And the person next door having a conversation, husband and wife, and there you are eating your toast, right? And then they take a glance at you, and then they go back to talking, and then they take another glance at you, and then they continue talking. And then finally the woman turns around and says, "You are so and so, right? I didn't know you look so ordinary." So I was like, okay.
We need better lines, guys. We need better lines.
Okay.
Okay.
I was quite happy with that, actually.
Okay. I wanted to also ask you about being an author, which I mentioned at the start, right? It's like one of the other things that you do. So, you have a younger daughter. You have two daughters. So one's almost going to be a teen.
Yeah, 12. The 12 is here.
12. But you write children's stories, so for younger kids.
Yes.
Do you think you'll move into the teen genre?
I hadn't thought about that. But I must say that I've been very struck by, like I mentioned with you, issues that residents are faced with. And in my mind, because I've done so many, I started with MPS when I was age 20, right? If on average I were meeting 40 families a week, right? Just think about the number of cases or residents I've come across over the years and the number of stories I've heard. And for some of them, I mean, not all of them, I know where that eventually ended up or led to. And it's crossed my mind before that actually maybe I should at some point in my life think about putting these stories together more like how should I put it? I wouldn't say learning points, but I think there are lessons to be learned. Sorry, like what do you do when you're faced with a divorce? How you should think about divorce. A divorce is not a panacea. It can lead to many other problems as well. Or, what should you do when you're in debt? And really don't borrow from money lenders. Don't borrow B to pay A, C to pay B, then D to pay C, because I've had cases whereby residents like owe 9 money lenders money when actually the principal amount was like $500 and it's ballooned up to like tens of thousands, because the interest rate just accumulates, right, one after the other.
Okay.
So it's like there are actually many, many lessons I think we can learn. And obviously everything's going to be anonymized. It's crossed my head before because I have children. And it's not just my children, it's about young people. And I think the greatest gift adults can give to younger people is to share our experiences. And in my case, I've been so blessed because it's not just personal experiences that I have, but I've learned so much from the experiences of others. And I'm sure that each and every resident who has encountered a challenge before would also want to pass his or her learning experience to the younger people in their lives to say, don't do this that mommy did. Or if you should do that, then know that this may be the outcome, and to move on from there, you see. So, no, I haven't thought about writing a book for tweens, but it has crossed my mind that there's just so much that we can learn from experiences, myself being an MP, that I would really yearn, I think, for more people and younger people, and particularly in Singapore, because we live in our society and government policies do result in certain ways we make our decisions, that we can learn from that. Yeah.
Okay. How do you find time? It's a lot. Because you have to think of the concept. Because, okay, so just for some context for people who are listening, you've written 4 books, right? Mm-hmm. The last one was at least...
Fiery Days.
Yes, which was released quite recently, right? In the last couple
National
of months?
National Day last year. Yeah.
Okay, so it's about ants and how they deal with life issues.
Yes.
And
thanks to my 7-year-old, 8-year-old who was very focused on ants, yes.
How do you come up with the concept? And then you sit down and you sketch, and you don't draw it because I know you have it illustrated, but you like map out the storyline and everything. Where do you find time?
I think I've been very fortunate in the sense that I do like creating stories for my children. So I find it actually quite easy to come up with storylines. Some of them can be very ridiculous and preposterous, incredulous, because children's stories, right? Some have learning points, some don't, but I get a good try at it almost every night now when I talk to my children. So like my younger one now, she has a fascination with eggs. She likes to hear about stories that deal with eggs, smiling eggs, angry eggs, eggs that break their shells, eggs that recover from breaking their shells, eggs that are in bubble wraps, eggs that want to fly, and all sorts of things. So I've created probably 30 stories about eggs, And she'll always want, what happened to the happy egg from, the first story you told me, don't know how many. I'm like, oh, which egg was that? So I think different people have different interest areas. And for myself, it's working with young children, is having a common language with them. And for me, it's storytelling. And also, I guess I use that as a way to share some experiences, but obviously crafted in a way that young children can understand. Yeah.
So in a way, this is kind of like a side hustle lah. So
well, unfortunately,
hustle.
people really don't make money from selling books. Oh. And in my case, anyway, all the proceeds go to charity anyway, so I don't take a single dollar from it, right? But it's just interest. It's just interest, and in a way, I do want to, minute these interactions I have with my children, and it also gives me great joy when I see other little children come up to me with a book and with my book and say, "Can you sign on it?" And I'm like, "Oh, thank you for buying the book." I hope you enjoyed it. And it just gives me a pleasure, I guess. Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone who's thinking of doing something on the side?
I think everybody has hobbies. It's just about to what extent you take those hobbies. Like a lot of ladies, they like to do some handicraft. Some of them just do handicraft because it's a hobby, and some of them eventually try to be an entrepreneur or sell things online. So it depends on the degree that you want to take it to. And I think everybody's free to, I know of so many young people around me, volunteers, who have a day job, and it's like after sales service in a software company kind of thing, right? And then the side hustle, flower arrangement, is a real
Completely different things.
completely different. And she's very artistic and whatsoever, but her day job, she's working in a software related company. But different people have different interests and passions, and maybe there is a certain way they think about what they should have as a career and what they can do in their spare time. And I think the great thing about being in Singapore, especially for a young person, is that you have opportunities to do different things.
You can be anything you want to be on the
Yes,
side.
if we got to put in some time and effort, and there's always risk if you try to be an entrepreneur. That is.
Okay. Miss Sun, thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing your personal thoughts with us about your work and also your being an author and your children. So that's it from The Usual Place
Thank
today.
you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So if you're watching this episode on YouTube, like, subscribe, or hit the notification bell to get fresh content. And you can also catch The Usual Place on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the ST app. I'll see you next time.